On a clear September morning in 2001, the world stood still as a tragedy of unimaginable scale unfolded before their eyes. The Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, symbols of American prosperity and power, crumbled to the ground after being struck by hijacked planes. The mastermind behind this horrific attack was Osama bin Laden, a man whose name would become synonymous with terror and who would haunt the global consciousness for years to come. But who was Osama bin Laden before he became the face of global terrorism? How did a young man from a wealthy Saudi family become the architect of one of the most devastating terrorist attacks in history? To understand the making of a mastermind, we must first delve into his early life, his influences, and the path that led him to embrace a radical ideology that would ultimately change the world. Osama bin Laden was born on March 10, 1957, in Riyadh, Saudi Arabia. He was the 17th of 52 children born to Mohammed bin Laden, a wealthy construction magnate with close ties to the Saudi royal family. Growing up in an environment of privilege and wealth, bin Laden had access to the best education and resources that money could buy. However, his upbringing was not one of indulgence, it was deeply rooted in the conservative and religious culture of Saudi Arabia. From a young age, bin Laden was exposed to the strict interpretations of Islam that were prevalent in his homeland. His family adhered to the Wahhabi sect, a fundamentalist branch of Sunni Islam that advocated for a return to what they considered the purest form of the religion. This early exposure to conservative religious teachings would play a significant role in shaping bin Laden's worldview. Despite his privileged background, bin Laden's childhood was not without its challenges. His father, Mohammed, was a strict and distant figure, and his relationship with Osama was more formal than affectionate. Mohammed bin Laden's death in a helicopter crash in 1967 left a profound impact on the young Osama, who was just 10 years old at the time. The loss of his father, coupled with the expectations placed on him as a member of the influential bin Laden family, began to shape the trajectory of his life. After his father's death, Osama bin Laden continued his education in Saudi Arabia, attending the prestigious King Abdulaziz University in Jeddah. It was here that bin Laden's interest in religion deepened, and he began to study the works of Islamic scholars who advocated for jihad, or holy war, as a means of defending and spreading Islam. At university, bin Laden was particularly influenced by the teachings of Abdullah Azzam, a Palestinian scholar who was a strong proponent of jihad against the enemies of Islam. Azzam's lectures and writings left a lasting impression on bin Laden, who began to see himself as a defender of the Muslim world against Western influence and oppression. During this time, bin Laden also became involved in the activities of the Muslim Brotherhood, a transnational Sunni Islamist organization that sought to establish an Islamic state governed by Sharia law. His association with the Brotherhood further reinforced his belief in the necessity of jihad and set him on the path toward radicalization. As bin Laden's religious fervor grew, so too did his disdain for Western influences in the Muslim world. He became increasingly vocal about his opposition to the presence of US military bases in Saudi Arabia, which he viewed as a violation of the sacred land of Islam. This resentment would later become a central theme in his jihadist ideology. The defining moment in Osama bin Laden's radicalization came in 1979 when the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan. The invasion was seen by many in the Muslim world as an attack on Islam, and it galvanized a global movement of Muslims who were eager to defend their brethren in Afghanistan. Bin Laden saw the Afghan conflict as a religious duty, and he quickly became involved in the effort to support the Afghan Mujahideen, the guerrilla fighters who were resisting the Soviet occupation. In 1980, he traveled to Pakistan, where he met with leaders of the Afghan resistance and offered his financial support and organizational skills. While in Pakistan, bin Laden established a network of contacts and resources that would later become the foundation of Al-Qaeda. He used his family's wealth to fund training camps, weapons purchases, and other logistical needs for the Mujahideen. Bin Laden also recruited fighters from across the Muslim world, urging them to join the jihad against the Soviet invaders. The Afghan-Soviet War was a pivotal experience for bin Laden. It not only solidified his commitment to jihad, but also provided him with the military and organizational experience that he would later use to orchestrate terrorist operations on a global scale. The war also deepened his belief in the power of jihad to achieve political and religious goals, a belief that would drive his actions for the rest of his life. By the time the Soviet forces withdrew from Afghanistan in 1989, Osama bin Laden had already begun laying the groundwork for his next phase of jihad. He returned to Saudi Arabia as a hero in the eyes of many Muslims, having played a significant role in the defeat of a superpower. However, bin Laden was not content with the victory in Afghanistan. He believed that the fight against the enemies of Islam was far from over. In 1988, bin Laden formally established Al-Qaeda, an organization dedicated to carrying out jihad on a global scale. Al-Qaeda, meaning the base in Arabic, was initially conceived as a support network for Muslims fighting against oppressive regimes. However, under bin Laden's leadership, it quickly evolved into a militant group with a singular focus to wage jihad against the West, particularly the United States. The creation of Al-Qaeda marked the beginning of a new era in bin Laden's life. No longer just a wealthy Saudi dissident, he had transformed into the leader of a global terrorist network. His vision was clear: to drive Western forces out of Muslim lands and to establish a caliphate governed by Sharia law. This new chapter in bin Laden's life would set the stage for the events of September 11, 2001. But before that fateful day, bin Laden would continue to build his network, recruit followers, and orchestrate attacks that would bring him closer to his ultimate goal. As the 1990s began, Osama bin Laden's hatred for the United States intensified. The catalyst for this growing animosity was the Gulf War of 1990 to 1991, when Iraq, under the leadership of Saddam Hussein, invaded Kuwait. The Saudi royal family feared that their own kingdom would be next. In response, they invited the United States and its coalition forces to station troops in Saudi Arabia to protect the region. To bin Laden, this was an unforgivable act of betrayal. The presence of American troops on Saudi soil, the birthplace of Islam and home to its two holiest cities, Mecca and Medina, was an abomination in his eyes. He saw it as a desecration of sacred land and a symbol of Western imperialism. Bin Laden, who had offered his own Mujahideen forces to defend Saudi Arabia, was outraged when the Saudi government chose the US military instead. This decision by the Saudi monarchy marked a turning point in bin Laden's ideological journey. He began to openly denounce the Saudi regime, accusing them of being puppets of the West and betrayers of Islam. His once cordial relationship with the royal family deteriorated rapidly, and bin Laden was soon exiled from his homeland. Fleeing to Sudan in 1992, bin Laden found a new base of operations from which he could plan and execute his jihadist activities. Sudan, under the Islamist government of Hassan al-Turabi, provided a safe haven for bin Laden and his followers. It was here that he would begin to expand Al-Qaeda into a global terrorist network, laying the groundwork for future attacks against the United States and its allies. While in Sudan, bin Laden focused on building Al-Qaeda's infrastructure. He established training camps, recruited fighters, and forged alliances with other militant groups. Bin Laden also invested in businesses and construction projects, using the profits to fund his terrorist activities. During this period, Al-Qaeda began to carry out its first attacks against Western targets, testing its capabilities and refining its tactics. One of the earliest and most significant of these attacks was the 1993 bombing of the World Trade Center in New York City. Although bin Laden was not directly involved in the planning or execution of the attack, it was carried out by a group of Islamic extremists with ties to Al-Qaeda. The bombing killed 6 people and injured over 1,000, marking the first time that Al-Qaeda-affiliated militants struck on American soil. The 1993 World Trade Center bombing was a warning shot, a precursor to the devastating attacks that would follow. It demonstrated that Al-Qaeda had both the intent and the capability to strike at the heart of the United States, and it set the stage for bin Laden's future plans. In the years that followed, Al-Qaeda's activities escalated. In 1996, bin Laden issued a fatwa, or religious decree, declaring war on the United States and its allies. He accused the US occupying Islamic lands, exploiting their resources, and supporting corrupt regimes in the Muslim world. This fatwa was a clear signal that bin Laden's focus had shifted from regional conflicts to a global jihad against the West. The year 1998 marked another escalation in Al-Qaeda's campaign against the United States. On August 7th of that year, Al-Qaeda operatives simultaneously bombed the US embassies in Nairobi, Kenya, and Dar es Salaam, Tanzania. The attacks killed 224 people, including 12 Americans, and injured thousands more. The East Africa embassy bombings were a watershed moment for Al-Qaeda. They demonstrated the organization's ability to coordinate large-scale attacks across multiple countries and underscored the growing threat that bin Laden posed to global security. The bombings also brought bin Laden to the forefront of American intelligence and law enforcement efforts, making him one of the most wanted men in the world. In response to the bombings, the United States launched cruise missile strikes against Al-Qaeda training camps in Afghanistan and a pharmaceutical plant in Sudan that was suspected of producing chemical weapons for bin Laden. However, these strikes failed to neutralize the threat, and bin Laden emerged unscathed, emboldened by his ability to evade capture. The embassy bombings also had another significant consequence. They solidified bin Laden's alliance with the Taliban, the ruling regime in Afghanistan. The Taliban, led by Mullah Omar, provided bin Laden with protection and allowed him to continue operating Al-Qaeda's training camps on Afghan soil. This alliance would prove crucial in the years leading up to the September 11th attacks. As the new millennium approached, Al-Qaeda's activities showed no signs of slowing down. In late 1999 US, intelligence agencies uncovered a plot by Al-Qaeda to carry out a series of attacks timed to coincide with the dawn of the year 2000. Dubbed the Millennium Plot, the plan included bombings of US landmarks and attacks on Israeli targets. One of the most significant components of the plot was an attempted bombing of Los Angeles International Airport, which was foiled when an Al-Qaeda operative was arrested at the U.S.-Canada border with explosives in his car. Although the Millennium Plot was largely thwarted, it highlighted the growing reach and ambition of Al-Qaeda under bin Laden's leadership. The following year, on October 12, 2000, Al-Qaeda struck again, this time targeting the USS Cole, a US Navy destroyer docked in the port of Aden, Yemen. 2 suicide bombers in a small boat detonated explosives alongside the ship, killing 17 American sailors and wounding 39 others. The attack on the USS Cole was another bold move by Al-Qaeda, further escalating the conflict between the United States and bin Laden's network. It also served as a chilling precursor to the more devastating attacks that bin Laden had in store for the following year. By the year 2000, Osama bin Laden was fully committed to his most ambitious and devastating plan, yet a coordinated attack on the United States that would surpass anything Al-Qaeda had done before. The plan, which had been in the works for years, involved hijacking commercial airliners and crashing them into iconic American landmarks, including the World Trade Center, the Pentagon, and potentially the White House or Capitol building. The final preparations for the September 11th attacks were carried out with meticulous planning and secrecy. Bin Laden personally selected and trained the 19 hijackers, most of whom were from Saudi Arabia. The operatives were trained in flight schools in the United States, where they learned to pilot commercial jets. Al-Qaeda's leadership, including bin Laden, closely monitored the progress of the plot, ensuring that every detail was accounted for. As the day of the attacks approached, bin Laden and his inner circle were confident that their plan would succeed. They believed that the attacks would not only cause massive casualties and destruction, but also strike a symbolic blow against the United States, which they viewed as the primary enemy of Islam. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the world would witness the horrifying culmination of bin Laden's jihadist vision, a vision that had been years in the making and would forever alter the course of history. On the morning of September 11, 2001, the skies over the eastern United States were clear, and the day began like any other. Millions of people went about their daily routines, unaware that the world as they knew it was about to change forever. At 8:46 a.m., the first of 4 hijacked planes, American Airlines Flight 11, crashed into the North Tower of the World Trade Center in New York City. The impact instantly killed hundreds of people and trapped many more in the upper floors of the building. Just 17 minutes later, at 9:03 a.m., United Airlines Flight 175 struck the South Tower. The horrific scenes of destruction were broadcast live on television, shocking viewers around the world. The images of the burning towers, with thick plumes of smoke billowing into the sky, became seared into the collective memory of millions. It quickly became clear that these were not accidents but deliberate acts of terrorism. As the chaos unfolded in New York, another hijacked plane, American Airlines Flight 77, crashed into the Pentagon at 9:37 a.m., further deepening the sense of horror and confusion. The Pentagon, the headquarters of the U.S. Department of Defense, symbolized American military power and the attack on it was a direct strike at the heart of the nation's defense establishment. The final plane, United Airlines Flight 93, was also hijacked and was headed towards Washington, D.C., with the presumed target being either the White House or the Capitol building. However, the passengers on Flight 93, aware of the fate of the other hijacked planes, bravely fought back against the hijackers. Their heroic actions caused the plane to crash into a field in Pennsylvania at 10:03 a.m., preventing further devastation but resulting in the loss of all on board. The attacks of September 11th left nearly 3,000 people dead and countless others injured. The scale of the destruction was unprecedented, and the psychological impact on the American public and the world was profound. In the span of just a few hours, Osama bin Laden had succeeded in orchestrating the deadliest terrorist attack in history. As the towers of the World Trade Center collapsed, the streets of Lower Manhattan were engulfed in dust and debris. First responders, including firefighters, police officers, and medical personnel, rushed to the scene, risking their lives to save others. Many of these heroes would perish in the attempt, as the buildings collapse buried them under tons of rubble. The nation was in a state of shock and disbelief. President George W. Bush, who was visiting a school in Florida at the time of the attacks, was quickly informed of the situation and taken to a secure location. In an address to the nation later that evening, President Bush vowed to bring those responsible for the attacks to justice, declaring, "We will make no distinction between the terrorists who committed these acts and those who harbor them." In the days following the attacks, the United States began to mobilize for war. The FBI and other intelligence agencies launched an immediate investigation, quickly identifying Osama bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as the perpetrators. The world rallied in support of the United States, with nations across the globe condemning the attacks and pledging their assistance in the fight against terrorism. At the same time, the US government took unprecedented steps to strengthen domestic security. The creation of the Department of Homeland Security, the implementation of the USA Patriot Act, and increased airport security measures were all direct responses to the events of September 11th. These measures reflected the new reality that terrorism had become the primary threat to national security. The September 11th attacks prompted a global response, as nations recognized that the threat posed by Al-Qaeda and similar extremist groups was not confined to the United States alone. The attacks highlighted the dangers of transnational terrorism and the need for international cooperation to combat it. In October 2001, the United States launched Operation Enduring Freedom, a military campaign aimed at dismantling Al-Qaeda and removing the Taliban regime in Afghanistan that had provided bin Laden with a safe haven. The invasion of Afghanistan marked the beginning of the war on terror, a global effort to eliminate terrorist organizations and prevent future attacks. The international community largely supported the U.S.-led invasion of Afghanistan, with NATO invoking Article 5 of its charter for the first time, declaring that an attack on one member was an attack on all. Allied forces from around the world joined the United States in the fight against the Taliban and Al-Qaeda. However, the war on terror also led to significant controversy and criticism. The invasion of Iraq in 2003, justified by the Bush administration as part of the broader fight against terrorism, became a deeply polarizing issue. Many questioned the link between Iraq and the 9/11 attacks, and the subsequent occupation of Iraq and Afghanistan raised concerns about the long-term consequences of US foreign policy in the Middle East. Despite the challenges and controversies, the global response to 9/11 underscored the international community's determination to confront terrorism. Osama bin Laden's actions had drawn the world's attention to the threat posed by extremist ideologies, and the fight against terrorism became a defining issue of the 21st century. In the years following the September 11th attacks, Osama bin Laden became the world's most wanted man. The United States placed a $25 million bounty on his head, and a massive manhunt was launched to capture or kill him. However, bin Laden proved to be an elusive target, evading capture for nearly a decade. Bin Laden's ability to avoid detection was due in large part to the vast network of supporters and operatives he had built over the years. Al-Qaeda operatives provided him with safe houses, transportation, and communication channels that allowed him to remain hidden. He also took extreme precautions, moving frequently and avoiding electronic communication that could be intercepted. During this time, bin Laden continued to release audio and video messages, taunting the United States and urging Muslims to join the jihad against the West. These messages served as propaganda tools for Al-Qaeda, helping to recruit new members and maintain the organization's influence despite the loss of key leaders and operatives. Bin Laden's continued evasion of capture became a source of frustration for the US government and its allies. It also became a symbol of the ongoing challenge of combating terrorism, as Al-Qaeda remained a potent threat even after the initial military successes in Afghanistan. As the years passed, the search for bin Laden intensified. Intelligence agencies around the world worked tirelessly to track his movements and gather information on his whereabouts. The hunt for bin Laden became a central focus of US counter-terrorism efforts, and it was only a matter of time before he would be found. By 2010, nearly a decade had passed since the September 11th attacks, and the hunt for Osama bin Laden had grown increasingly urgent. Despite numerous close calls and extensive intelligence efforts, bin Laden remained at large, living in the shadows and continuing to inspire jihadist activities around the world. The frustration among US intelligence agencies was palpable, but there were also growing signs that the net was finally closing in. In mid-2010, a crucial breakthrough occurred when the CIA identified a courier with close ties to bin Laden. This man, known by the codename Abu Ahmed al-Kuwaiti, had been on the CIA's radar for years, but his significance had only recently become apparent. Through extensive surveillance and intelligence gathering, US operatives tracked al-Kuwaiti to a large, secure compound in Abbottabad, Pakistan, a town nestled in the foothills of the Himalayas. The compound, with its high walls, barbed wire, and lack of internet or phone connections, immediately aroused suspicion. It was an unusual structure, far more fortified than any of the other homes in the area, and its residents were highly secretive. The CIA soon became convinced that this was the hiding place of Osama bin Laden. Over the next several months, US intelligence agencies monitored the compound closely using satellite imagery, surveillance drones, and human intelligence to gather as much information as possible. Despite the mounting evidence, the operation was fraught with uncertainty. The intelligence was not definitive, and there was no absolute confirmation that bin Laden was inside the compound. Nevertheless, the US government decided that the potential rewards outweighed the risks. On the night of May 1, 2011, under the cover of darkness, two Black Hawk helicopters carrying a team of US Navy SEALs took off from an airbase in Afghanistan. The mission, codenamed Operation Neptune Spear, was one of the most daring and secretive operations in modern military history. The objective was clear: to capture or kill Osama bin Laden. As the helicopters approached the compound in Abbottabad, the SEALs prepared for a high-stakes raid. Upon arrival, one of the helicopters experienced mechanical difficulties and was forced to make a hard landing inside the compound. Despite this setback, the SEALs quickly regrouped and moved forward with the mission. The SEALs breached the compound's walls and methodically cleared each room, encountering armed resistance from bin Laden's guards. The operation was intense but brief, lasting less than 40 minutes. On the upper floor of the main house, the SEALs confronted bin Laden. After a brief exchange of fire, bin Laden was shot and killed. The SEALs quickly confirmed his identity and secured his body, taking care to gather valuable intelligence from the compound before exfiltrating. Back in the United States, President Barack Obama and his national security team watched the operation unfold in real time from the Situation Room in the White House. When confirmation came that bin Laden had been killed, there was a palpable sense of relief and triumph. After nearly a decade of relentless pursuit, the man responsible for the September 11th attacks had finally been brought to justice. The death of Osama bin Laden was met with a mixture of jubilation and solemn reflection across the United States and around the world. In the streets of Washington, D.C., New York City, and other major cities, crowds gathered to celebrate the news. For many Americans, bin Laden's death symbolized a measure of closure and justice for the thousands of lives lost on September 11th, 2001. However, bin Laden's death also raised questions about the future of global terrorism and the ongoing war against Al-Qaeda. While the death of bin Laden was a significant blow to Al-Qaeda, it did not mean the end of the organization or its ideology. Al-Qaeda had already decentralized, with affiliates in the Arabian Peninsula, North Africa, and other regions continuing to operate independently. In the days following the raid, the US government worked quickly to manage the potential fallout. Bin Laden's body was buried at sea, in accordance with Islamic tradition, in an effort to prevent his grave from becoming a shrine for extremists. The operation itself was also kept under wraps until President Obama made the official announcement to the nation, confirming that Osama bin Laden had been killed. Even in death, Osama bin Laden's legacy continues to cast a long shadow over global affairs. His role in the September 11th attacks made him a symbol of the jihadist movement, and his actions profoundly shaped US, foreign and domestic policies for years to come. The story of Osama bin Laden is a reminder of the devastating consequences of extremism and the challenges that the world continues to face in combating terrorism. His life and death are emblematic of a turbulent era in global history, one defined by the clash between radical ideologies and the efforts to preserve peace and security. As we reflect on the life of Osama bin Laden, it is crucial to remember the victims of his actions and the countless lives that were affected by his pursuit of a twisted vision. The fight against terrorism is far from over, but the lessons learned from the hunt for bin Laden and the events of 9/11 will continue to guide the world in its efforts to prevent future atrocities.